Western commentators have called it an Arab Spring. The #1 state sponsor of terror calls it a great Islamic awakening. So which is it? Today on the Trumpet Daily, we examine the earth-shaking events that have happened in the Middle East and North Africa just this year.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
If you haven't gone through it yet, I'd encourage you to go back and read my father's personal from the Trumpet magazine in October, where he just talked about this Islamic movement as it's spreading through the Middle East in all of these revolutions that we keep hearing about and reading about and seeing on television. He wrote, to begin with his article, he wrote, Egypt and Libya to join Iran's terror network. That was the title, and this is how he introduced the piece. He said, Iran, the #1 state sponsor of terrorism by far, has bludgeoned its way into controlling Lebanon and Gaza and has become the backbone of Syrian terrorism. Iran also bombed and butchered its way into the dominant role in Iraq and Afghanistan after America thought it had won those wars. He says, and now is empowering the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists to get control of Egypt. He says, now America and the West have paved the way for another Iranian victory. In Libya, we're rejoicing about the overthrow of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, while we should be mourning, he says. Libyan chaos is now the ideal setting for Iran to bring that nation into its deadly terrorist web. The government that replaces Gaddafi will be 1,000 times worse. So that's what he said. This was on the website a number of weeks ago and now is featured in that October issue of the Trumpet magazine. And it's interesting if you look at some of the coverage of what's been happening there across the Middle East since back in January. With respect to Egypt, as I'll remind you of a little bit later in today's forum, it took just a couple of months before the liberal intelligentsia awakened to what was really happening there. Early on, of course, we were there cheering on the protesters in the streets, cheering on the spread of democracy. This, for example, is what the New York Times had to say. After it started to catch on in March, that maybe in Egypt it's not going as well as we thought it was. It says this is from March 24th, in post-revolutionary Egypt, where hope and confusion collide in the daily struggle to build a new nation, religion has emerged as a powerful political force following an uprising that was based on secular ideals. The Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist group once banned by the state, is at the forefront, transformed into a tacit partner with the military government that many fear will thwart fundamental changes. Mubarak had banned this group, this terrorist organization. They had no say in the government prior to Mubarak's fall, and then as soon as he's moved out of the way, then immediately they come to the top, just as we said that they would. And we said this was going to happen, of course, long before even Mubarak was pushed aside, as Trumpet readers know. The New York Times continued from back in March. It's also clear that the young, educated, secular activists who initially propelled the non-ideological revolution are no longer the driving political force, at least not at the moment. And then the Times goes on and quotes an Egyptian TV producer who talked about how the young people were gone, all the ones that came forward and protested in the streets and wanted democracy, wanted more freedom, that it wasn't but just a few weeks and those people were gone from the streets. He says it was evident, quoting this TV producer, it was evident in the last few weeks when you saw a lot of bearded people taking charge. The youth, he said, are gone. The youth are moved aside and the radicals quickly assumed control of the situation there. And then what did the West do? What did the United States do? Well, we just quickly moved on to the next state, the next nation, the next authoritarian dictator, the next leader that we needed to clear away. And how is this turning out? In Libya, I mean, how is this turning out? It's interesting just looking at some of the more recent reports. If it took a few months for the major media to catch on to what was happening in Egypt, this time around it seems like it's just been a couple of weeks that they're starting to sense that everything in Libya is going wrong. This is from the New York Times on September 14th. It talked about how the most popular politician in Libya, now that Gaddafi's been shoved aside and is off in hiding, the most popular politician now in Libya is an Islamic scholar. The most powerful military leader used to head up an organization with strong ties to Al-Qaeda. These are the ones that are rising to the surface. And this fast after Gaddafi was moved out. The Times says, the growing influence of Islamists in Libya raises hard questions about the ultimate character of the government and society that will rise in place of Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi's autocracy. This is the New York Times, mind you, not Stratfor, not a conservative blog or something like that. It's the New York Times, just a few weeks on. It said the United States and Libya's new leaders say the Islamists, a well-organized group in a mostly moderate country, are sending signals that they are dedicated to democratic pluralism. They say there's no reason to doubt the Islamists' sincerity. That's coming from the United States. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. They're sincere, these Islamic scholars. They just want a pluralistic democracy. They just want everybody to have a say. You have to understand that their intentions are very sincere, motivated by desires for peace. It's an incredible statement, really, when you think of it. The United States and Libyan officials that, as the Times piece brings out, are Islamic leaders, Islamic scholars. The U.S. officials and the Libyan leaders are saying, don't worry, everything is okay. It's not going to be an increase in radicalism. It won't be like that. That's what they say. And even the New York Times was skeptical. The Times continued, but as in Egypt and Tunisia, listen to this, as in Egypt and Tunisia, the latest upheaval of the Arab Spring deposed a dictator who had suppressed hardcore Islamists. And there are some worrisome signs about what kind of government will follow. They removed the dictators that held down the forces of terrorism, in other words. And now there are some serious questions about what comes next in Libya, some worrisome signs, as it says there, about what kind of government will follow. Just a few days ago, NATO's Secretary General, NATO's the one that pushed Gaddafi out, but he's now warning the very body, the very group or alliance that helped the rebels get rid of Gaddafi is now warning that the Islamists may take over. That's coming from the NATO Secretary General. According to the Daily Telegraph, Libya is in danger of falling into the hands of Islamic extremists if a stable government is not rapidly established. It relied its reporting on that Secretary General, as I said. In an interview with the NATO Secretary General, according to this piece, he said Islamic extremists would try to exploit any weaknesses created as the country tried to rebuild after 4 decades of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's rule. The Telegraph says his words, speaking of the NATO chief, his words will cast a damper over the euphoria sweeping Tripoli in the wake of the revolution. A damper. I mean, if ever there was a damper, that would be it. That the Islamists now would gain control. Western commentators all along have called these revolutions, collectively, the Arab Spring. And if you think about spring, we're in a changing season now, and we like the cooler weather because we've had such a hot summer here. And the wonderful thing about spring is there's a change from the cold weather to warmer weather, and new life springs forward everywhere that you look. There's greenery, there's colors in the foliage, flowers and such. And just that term in itself implies that this is some kind of peaceful movement that's sweeping across the Middle East. The Iranian king of the Middle East has coined another, more accurate term to describe what's happening, and that is an Islamic awakening. That's what's taking place in actual fact across the Middle East. An Islamic awakening. It's not an Arab Spring. We can call it something nice. We can say there's nothing to worry about. We can say there's peaceful intentions. But what is it that's actually happening? Look at what's happening. Quoting again from that New York Times piece, it says Fathi bin Issa, a former Edelaf member, this is the emerging government now that's beginning to take shape in Libya. Speaking of this one member, who became an early representative on the Tripoli Council, said he quit his position after learning that the Muslim Brotherhood members who dominate that body wanted to ban theater, cinema, and the arts like sculpture of the human form. They were like the Taliban, he said. We didn't get rid of Gaddafi to replace him with such people. The final straw, he said, came when Edelaf began circulating a proposed fatwa or decree to bar women from driving. That's it. He had enough. He got out. He left the council. It's like the Taliban, he said. The New York Times says most Libyans are quick to bristle at suggestions that their own Islamists might one day go the way of Iran, where after the fall of the Shah, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stomped out a short-lived liberal government by denouncing democracy as un-Islamic. It's the New York Times comparing this to 1979, what happened in Iran. You see these comparisons now made just routinely. Even in the liberal press, that's awakening to the awakening that's taking place in the Middle East. Mr. Salabi, this is the Islamic scholar that's rising to the top in Libya. The Times interviewed him. Mr. Salabi said he hoped Libyans could find a leader on the model of George Washington, whom he had been reading about lately. After his struggle, he went back to his farm, even though the American people wanted him to be president. Mr. Salabi said he's a great man. That's all that he wants, a U.S.-style revolution to be led by someone, after the model of George Washington. Referring to Mr. Salabi, Mr. bin Issa, the one who left the council, who said, according to the Times, he's received death threats since breaking with the Islamists, retorted, he's just hiding his intentions. He says one thing to the BBC and another to Al Jazeera. If you believe him, then you don't know the Muslim Brothers. You don't know the Muslim Brothers. He knows what's happening, and anyone that's honest knows what's happening. And yet, it's the Islamic leaders and, incredibly, and the United States government that's saying nothing to worry about here. Everything's going to be A-okay. Let's look at Jeremiah 6. Tells you something about the problem with the United States of America today. The willful blindness. I mean, it's incredible to think about how blind we are to what's happening. I mean, here we are backing up the message coming from these Islamists that are taking control, and what we say agrees with what they say. Jeremiah 6 and verse 14, it says, they have healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people, slightly saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. See, the message coming out of the nations that descended from Israel anciently, the United States, Britain, and even to some extent Judah. I think Judah is more aware of what's happening because they're right in the midst of this. And Israel, as we covered recently at a forum, the little nation of Israel, I mean, they are being pinched in. They are surrounded. They're a little more clued in as to the dangers that are gathering forces all around. But over here, I mean, our heads are just deep into the sand. Willful blindness. Peace, peace. When they come saying that everything's going to be okay, that's when God says, you better watch out. You better be careful. The message today, coming out of the United States and Britain, it just glosses over all of these problems, these evils that we see mounting. The Living Bible says you can't heal a wound by saying it's not there. Yet the priests and the prophets give assurances of peace when all is war. Never has there been so much talk about peace. And look at how this planet is just war-torn. Look at how the spread of violence and revolution is increasing in intensity. And here we are. I mean, some of the greatest minds of our day are actually under the illusion that things are getting better, that we're drawing closer to peace. I mean, we're eager to give the Nobel Peace Prize to the champions of terror. What an illusion. What willful blindness this is. God says the nature of man is the problem here. We don't have time to go into a study on that, but it's also in the book of Jeremiah and elsewhere. It's man's heart, man's nature that's flawed. The absence of any real purpose in life, together with this constant broadcast coming from the devil, the god of this world, that's fueling this hatred, the spread of evil. Evil men and seducers, it says in 2 Timothy 3, shall wax worse and worse. That's what we're seeing. Now, we can pretend that the motivating forces behind these revolutions, we can pretend it's all a peaceful effort. We can ignore the existential threat that's right in front of us. We can even call it a beautiful Arab Spring, if we like. But such willful blindness, students, willful blindness won't make the problems go away. That's what God is telling us here. Mr. Hilliker wrote an article recently at thetrumpet.com, an amazing article about two lawsuits that have been filed by the families of 9/11 victims as to who was behind 9/11. They filed their lawsuits against the Islamic Republic of Iran, of all places. I don't know how much success they'll have in the courts, or how that the courts could ever obligate Iran to pay up if they're found guilty. But what he has in his article is quite interesting, again, about just how blind we are to the obvious, what should be obvious. Mr. Hilliker wrote that in 2004, the National Commission tasked with examining the 9/11 attacks was behind schedule and nearing the end of a 60-day extension that it had received to release its report. With just a week to go, this is the intelligence estimate that was to be given about 9/11, who was behind it. He says, with a week to go, staffers got new information, an intelligence bombshell, a national security agency summary of the American intelligence community's findings on how Iran had helped the 9/11 hijackers. Helped, and not just turned a blind eye to it. Helped the terrorists. It was based on dozens of NSA documents that explained the Al-Qaeda-Tehran relationship. Trouble was, Mr. Hilliker says, there wasn't enough time to fully process the explosive information before the report had to be published. And so he goes on to explain, he quotes a bit of the evidence from some of those documents that turned up. He says, under the subhead Assistance from Hezbollah and Iran to Al-Qaeda, it described how Iran frequently turned a blind eye to recruiters, travel facilitators, and document forgers streaming in and out of Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan, in and out of Afghanistan to Iran, and so on. It also said Iran had covertly facilitated travel for several of the 9/11 hijackers in the months before the attack. The CIA considered the information so touchy, in part because it exposed the CIA's failure to recognize in advance just how important it was, that it lobbied, the CIA that the CIA lobbied unsuccessfully to have it stricken from the report. It was just a little addendum put at the end of the report, and then the commission came forward and said, we didn't have time to get into this, but it needs further investigation. That was in 2004. And of course, since then, nothing has happened. At least nothing government-sponsored has happened. But as he brings out in his article, families of the victims took it upon themselves to investigate the matter. They took it upon themselves to look into this, to find out what happened, to find out who was behind it. We had no governmental authority, hardly any budget, and no access to classified intelligence or intelligence assets, wrote Kenneth Timmerman. He's one who helped in the effort. But what we found and made public starting this May is enough to hang a fish. Mr. Hilliker continued. What they found forms the basis of their lawsuits against Iran. This legal team is convinced, based on years of research, interviewing intelligence officials, CIA agents, Iranian defectors, and others, it can prove that the terrorists who plotted and carried out 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, were backed by Iran. This is something that should come as no surprise to trumpet readers. Let's look at Daniel 11. I didn't jot down the title of Mr. Hilliker's article, but it was something to the effect that Iran was behind it, and you can expect America to do nothing, absolutely nothing, about it. This has been the track record for 10 years now. Ynet News, an Israeli publication, said this about these two lawsuits. The huge amount of evidence included in the lawsuit comes together to form a fascinating charge. Starting in the 1990s, Iran and Hezbollah helped Osama bin Laden and his deputy, al-Zawahiri, create a new terror organization from scratch to be headed by Afghanistan veterans and members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. It says Iran trained group members, equipped them with advanced technological means, enabled them to move freely, and provided them with plenty of terror-related expertise and experience accumulated by Hezbollah in its operations against Israel and the United States. Pretty extensive involvement, in other words. Daniel 11 here, in verse 40, it says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and many ships. And he shall enter into countries and shall overflow and pass over." The time setting, as we've brought out so many times before, is the time of the end here, this clash between the king of the south and the king of the north, the European superpower that's now developing, that's now emerging onto the scene. Never mind the crisis that's happening in Europe regarding the finance, the economy. All that's going to bring about is a stronger, if not smaller, but certainly a stronger European power. But the king of the south is headed by Iran, something the trumpet's been saying, something my father's been saying for 2 decades now. 2 decades. The spread of Islam, the Islamic awakening, in essence. Verse 41, speaking of this European power, he shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. It goes on in verse 42 and verse 43 to mention nations like Egypt and Libya, which is why this particular prophecy is why we've been waiting for and preparing you for and preparing our readers for an Islamic awakening in Egypt and now Libya. My father wrote this in the November-December 1990 issue of the Trumpet. Presently, he said, Egypt would not closely befriend a leader like the king of the south, but with a few violent assassinations that could change quickly. Such acts can rapidly change the people's minds. Revolutions often result. Maybe the assassinations didn't trigger it, but we sure have seen the revolutions. We've sure seen this awakening. In 1994, you can remember my father asking if Iraq was about to fall to Iran, and now that's happened. Now it's happened. We've seen it. After 9/11, remember the trumpet was there saying, well, it's a noble-sounding effort. You can see why there'd be this push to retaliate, to try to defend America, but it's misguided because it's not going after the source. It's not going to the cause, the Islamic Republic. It went to Iraq, and I mean, even there, as my father has said before, that could have been a perfect staging ground. Same with Afghanistan. to regain the upper hand. Instead, we've just managed to clear out the authoritarians that were there, and now to prepare for our departure, as Iran just steps in and takes over. So much, you see, has been happening. My father said back in a January program that was taped for the Key of David that we can look forward to the spread of radicalism in Libya, and now that's what we're seeing. And as I said at the start, it's not taking a few months even for the major media to awaken to what's happening. It's now just a matter of weeks for them to see what we have been talking about. This is not, no matter how nice it might sound to say so, it's not an Arab Spring-like experience styled after a U.S. revolution with a leader like George Washington that brings about the spread of pluralistic democracy. It's not that at all. In fact, it is, as Iran is saying it is, an Islamic awakening. Call the number on your screen right now and ask for this new packet that we've assembled, Iran Helped Plan 9/11. The abundant supply of evidence to support that charge just keeps pouring in, and yet over the past decade, America has done nothing about it. Why is that? Prophecy provides the answer. As you'll learn from this study, God has a lot to say about what is now happening in the Middle East. Just call our operators and ask for Iran Helped Plan 9/11. It's free for the asking. This packet also contains the article my father recently wrote for the Trumpet magazine, Egypt and Libya to join Iran's terror network. This is such an important article. We're talking about events here that have been prophesied to happen for thousands of years, and they're events prophesied to happen right before the Great Tribulation that Jesus Christ spoke of. This article, by the way, is the same one included in this magazine, the latest issue of the Trumpet. We have over 300,000 subscribers to this monthly publication, so if you haven't already, you can get a free one-year subscription to this publication today. Just let the operators know that you'd like to become a Trumpet subscriber. Also, be sure to request this little booklet, The King of the South, so that you can see for yourself what we've been saying about Iran and the Middle East for nearly 2 decades now. All of it is based on the sure word of Bible prophecy, and all of it is now happening before our eyes. Thanks as always for joining us today. We'll see you again tomorrow.
If you would prefer to write for today's literature, send your request to The Trumpet Daily, Post Office Box 3700, Edmond, Oklahoma 73083. In Canada, send your request to The Trumpet Daily, Post Office Box 400, Campbellville, Ontario, LOP 1BO. Don't forget to visit us online at thetrumpetdaily.com. Here you can watch episodes of The Trumpet Daily and download the literature offered. Also, be sure to visit our YouTube channel, The Trumpet Daily.